For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. 34 years ago this week, the Indian military embarked on its first out-of-area contingency, or as they call it, overseas deployment in its history. What was the outcome and what did the Indian peacekeeping force do in Sri Lanka is the subject of this week's Simply Nitin. I am Nitin Gokhale. On 29 July 1987, the Indian and the Sri Lankan governments signed what has come to be known as the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord in Colombo, signed by Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi of India and President J.R. Jayawardene of Sri Lanka. The accord set off a chain of events that altered not just the relationship between India, Sri Lanka, India and the Tamils of Sri Lanka, and of course led finally to the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi when he was not Prime Minister in the year 1991. The accord was conceived by India to try and disarm the Tamil militant groups, mainly the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam or the Tamil Tigers, who went on to fight the insurgency in Sri Lanka even till 2009, when eventually its chief Vellupillai Prabhakaran and the entire LTTE cadres were either killed or disarmed and arrested. But that's a long story of nearly 35 years plus of the Sri Lankan or the Tamil Sri Lankan insurgency in the island of Sri Lanka. But what happened on 29th of July 1987 is something interesting. India signed the accord without full consent of the Tamil groups or the Tamil militant groups who were fighting for autonomy and fighting for more rights for the Tamils or equal treatment to the Tamils in north and east of Sri Lanka, whereas the majority Sinhalese were not in favor of giving them autonomy or even some of the development projects that the Tamils were asking for. It had begun much earlier. There were riots in 1983, which had led to a lot of bitterness between the majority Sinhalese and the minority Tamil groups or the population. And of course, the Tamils were massacred in Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka, in 1983, which had fed into the insurgency in those 4 or 5 years. The LTTE had become all-powerful, and yet India played a rather duplicitous role. On one hand, the Research and Analysis Wing, India's external intelligence agency, was supplying arms to the militant groups, mainly the LTTE, training their cadres in fighting the guerrilla war in India at various places. And on the other, there was the political attempt to try and have a settlement between the Tamils and the Sinhalese. So, after a lot of bitterness, a lot of discussion, in fact, one of the discussions took place in the Bhutanese capital of Thimphu, where both sides met on what was then considered neutral ground, and the terms and conditions of the accord were thrashed out. Prabhakaran and his top advisors were confined to the Ashoka Hotel in New Delhi when the accord was being finalized. On 28th of July, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi flew to Colombo to sign the accord. But before that, in the run-up to the accord, there was a lot of bitterness between India and Sri Lanka. On 3rd of June 1987, India had tried to send a flotilla of ships with food and other aid, medicines for the besieged Tamil areas of northern Sri Lanka, where the Sri Lankan army had launched an operation which was almost surrounding the Tamil areas and trying to run over the Tamil insurgency. When that was blocked by the Sri Lankan Navy, then the Indians launched what was called Operation Pumalai, of which I have referred to in one of my Simply Nitin episodes just about a month or two ago, when the Indian transport aircraft, the Air Force transport aircraft went to northern Sri Lanka and dropped food aid and of course some of the pamphlets telling the Sri Lankan Tamils that India was with them. With that, India actually sort of gave up neutrality in the fight between Tamils and Sinhalese in Sri Lanka by choosing to support the Tamils in Sri Lanka. The Sinhalese were bitter, they were angry, but because they were a smaller power, because they needed India's support, they agreed, or President Jayawardene agreed to the accord. India, despite knowing that the accord was not very welcome by the Sinhalese majority, nor by the dominant Tamil group, the LTTE, went ahead and signed the accord. The RNAW was told to halt the training and the arms supply to the LTTE and the other groups. The accord was signed, and the unhappiness on both sides was missed by India somehow, or the Indian decision makers. That unhappiness was manifest in Colombo itself when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was returning to Delhi to take his flight. While taking a guard of honor, one Sri Lankan naval rating, actually angered by the unfairness of the accord as he thought, tried to attack Rajiv Gandhi with his rifle butt. He escaped simply because he was a young Prime Minister, he had the reflexes, and he ducked the blow by the Sri Lankan rating and escaped with minor injuries. But that showed the anger and the bitterness amongst the Sinhalese. But there was more to come. As Gandhi was returning to Delhi, the Indian forces, the Indian military, the Indian army, started landing in the northern areas of Sri Lanka, in the Jaffna Peninsula especially. They had come there as what was the name, as the name denotes, the IPKF, the Indian Peacekeeping Force. They went there to what is called the enforcement of the accord, or rather keeping peace in the area between Sinhalese and the Tamils. Initially, a small contingent went. The 54 division from Secunderabad was gradually inducted into northern Sri Lanka. The Indian officers had no clear idea about, our Indian contingent had no clear idea about what their role was going to be. Although initially the Tamil population in Sri Lanka or in Jaffna welcomed them hugely. They in fact garlanded them, they gave them food, they said that you are our saviors, and in fact publicly welcomed the Indian army there. But when Prabhakaran returned from Delhi, a bitter man, not fully convinced that this accord was good for the Tamils, he slowly and gradually started creating problems for the Indian peacekeeping force. And that is where the accord went sour. Of course, Sri Lankans had the last laugh, because finally the Indian peacekeeping force became Indian peace enforcers. They had to now fight the LTTE because the LTTE had decided to take on the Indian army. And because they knew the lay of the land, they knew the terrain, they knew exactly where the Indian army was going wrong, the LTTE started gaining upper hand militarily, at least in the initial months. Then India inducted more and more forces, Air Force came in, tanks came in, and lots of other things started happening where the Indians started losing officers and men in ambushes by the LTTE. This was not something envisaged in the accord, but that's where it went wrong. From October 1987, when the fighting between Indian peacekeeping force and the LTTE began, until March 1990, the Indian military, or the Indian army mainly, had a tough time. Although the tide had started turning towards the end of 89, early 1990. But then, by that time, the political situation had changed. There was a different government in India, there was a different government in Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lankan government, led by President Premadasa, who was actually a prime minister under J.R. Jayawardene and had become president, ordered the Indian peacekeeping force out. Here in India, Rajiv Gandhi lost power, and VP Singh was the prime minister, who also didn't have the stomach to carry on, although the IPKF commanders and officers say that if allowed to continue for another year or so, they would have demolished or completely decimated the LTTE if they were given that chance. That was not to happen. India had to come back. 1,200 soldiers and officers were killed in that IPKF overseas deployment in Sri Lanka. And that remains a bitter memory for the Indian military. In fact, if you go to our website, you will find a couple of articles in this past 1 week, at least one article and one interview with the overall force commander of the Indian peacekeeping force, Lieutenant A.S. Kalkat, who has spoken about his experience of being the overall force commander of IPKF. It was not a very pleasant experience for the Indian military, but that's exactly why lessons have to be learned from what went wrong. That's the only major deployment of the Indian military overseas, and that didn't end too well for India. It could have ended well, but it didn't end too well, as I mentioned. It's a huge kind of learning experience for the Indian peacekeeping force and the Indian military. The current Indian Army Chief, General M.M. Naravane, was also a young officer there, and there are several others who fought there and had very bitter and sometimes very learning experience. In fact, a couple of books I can recommend. It's a very depressing book, but must read for students of military history. This is by Brigadier Ravi Palsokar, who commanded the 7th Brigade in Mulaitevu in northern Sri Lanka. And the book itself tells you, the title of the book itself tells you what it may contain. Do go and read this if you can. And there's nobody better who knew the Tamil Tigers as an insider, almost like an insider, a reporter called M.R. Narayan Swamy, who has written a series of books, but this book encapsulates everything about what was happening in the decade of the 80s when the accord was signed, and of course the IPKF went into Sri Lanka. So that is the history one must know about, even if it's not very pleasant. That's what I thought, that I will sort of flag this issue, because this is the week when the accord was signed and the IPKF started landing in Sri Lanka. The story is long. I don't want to waste your time in listening to what I am saying. Do go and read many of these books that have been written by not just these two authors, but by somebody like Rohan Gunaratne, who's an acknowledged expert on terrorism and counter-terrorism, a Sri Lankan expert, who's also written a book called India's Intervention, India's Military Intervention. That book also is very educative. And of course, we know what happened finally between 2006 and 2009, when the Sri Lankan forces decimated the LTTE militarily and killed Prabhakaran finally to end the civil war or the insurgency in Sri Lanka. But that's another story which I have spoken about earlier. I may speak about it again sometime, but that's the experience that the Indian military had, the Indian political establishment had. One key player in the early months of the run-up to the accord was Hardeep Puri, the current Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas and Urban Development and Housing, who was then a Foreign Service officer posted in Colombo as First Secretary, who knew Prabhakaran individually and had spoken to him, had taken him to Delhi and to Colombo a number of times during the negotiations that were happening. But that's again another story. We will talk about it sometime. Until the next time, it's goodbye. But don't forget to log on to our YouTube channel, subscribe to it. Also follow our social media handles on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. And of course, keep giving us feedback on what do you think about StratNews Global and of course, Simply Nitin. Do keep watching. Until the next time, it's goodbye.